Dogs don't fear the dark. They listen to what hides inside it. The house had been quiet for hours, the kind of deep, hollow quiet that settles into old wood and lingers in the corners like something waiting to be noticed. And Daniel Carter had almost convinced himself that this place, with its sagging beams and tired walls, was finally going to give him the one thing he hadn't found in years: peace. But sometime past midnight, when the cold pressed softly against the windows and the world outside seemed to hold its breath, Rex lifted his head, not with a bark, not with panic, but with a stillness so sharp it cut through the silence like a whisper you weren't meant to hear. And Daniel felt it before he saw it, that subtle shift in the room, the way the air seemed to lean ever so slightly toward the basement door, as if something below had called without making a sound. And Rex stood slowly, his paws quiet against the wooden floor, his ears angled forward with a precision Daniel had only ever seen during their years in service, when the dog would lock onto something distant, something hidden, something human senses couldn't quite reach. And for a moment Daniel didn't move, didn't speak, because there was a familiarity in that posture, a memory buried somewhere between instinct and experience, the kind that told him this wasn't nothing. This wasn't just an old house settling into itself. And Rex took a step toward the basement door, then another, stopping just inches away, his nose lifting slightly, testing the air as if it carried a scent too faint to name. And then he did something that unsettled Daniel more than any bark could have. He waited, completely still, like he was listening for a response, and the seconds stretched longer than they should have, thick and heavy, until Daniel finally exhaled and pushed himself up from the worn couch, his joints stiff from the cold and the quiet weight of years that hadn't quite left his bones. And he crossed the room slowly, each step deliberate, the old floorboards answering beneath him with soft creaks that sounded louder than they should have in the silence. And when he reached the door, his hand hovered over the knob just a fraction longer than necessary, not out of fear, but out of something harder to name, something like recognition, like a part of him already knew that whatever Rex had found wasn't going to be simple. And as his fingers finally closed around the metal, cold and unwelcoming against his skin, Rex shifted his weight, placing one paw gently against the bottom of the door, right where the wood darkened slightly with age. And Daniel noticed it then, the faintest difference in the grain, a subtle unevenness, like something beneath had changed the way the floor remembered itself. And he turned the knob slowly, the hinges giving a low, tired sigh as the door opened just enough for the darkness below to reveal itself, not as a void, but as something deeper, something that didn't feel empty at all. And Rex leaned forward, not pulling, not rushing, just guiding, and Daniel followed. Because he had learned a long time ago that when a dog like Rex listened this closely, it wasn't fear leading the way, it was truth. And sometimes the truth didn't come looking for you. Sometimes it waited quietly, just beneath your feet, until you were ready to hear it. The wooden steps groaned softly beneath Daniel's weight as he descended, each one carrying a hollow echo that seemed to linger longer than it should have, as if the sound itself had nowhere to go. And the air changed with every inch downward, growing cooler, heavier, not in a way that chilled the skin but in a way that settled quietly against the chest. And Rex moved ahead of him with measured steps, not pulling on the leash, not rushing into the dark, but guiding with a calm certainty that made Daniel pay closer attention to everything around him. The faint scent of old dust mixed with something metallic, the subtle shift in temperature that did not match the cold night outside. The way the silence here felt different from the silence upstairs, deeper, almost layered, like it had been building over years without interruption. And when his boots finally touched the basement floor, Daniel paused, letting his eyes adjust to the dim glow from the single bulb above, its weak light flickering just enough to cast slow-moving shadows along the walls, shadows that seemed to breathe with the structure of the house itself. And Rex stopped near the far corner, the same spot he had marked above, placing his paw gently against the wooden planks that lined the floor. And Daniel noticed again that subtle difference, the way the boards there sat just slightly uneven, not broken, not damaged, but disturbed, like something beneath them had shifted long ago and never quite settled back into place. And he crouched, slowly, running his hand across the surface, feeling the grain of the wood, the faint ridges worn smooth by time. And then something else, a soft, almost imperceptible vibration, so faint he might have dismissed it if Rex had not remained so still beside him, watching, waiting, as if this moment mattered more than any command he had ever followed. And Daniel pressed his palm flat against the floor, holding it there, listening through his skin the way he had learned to listen through walls years ago. And for a brief second, he thought of distant nights overseas, when the ground itself had whispered warnings before anything visible ever appeared. And he pulled his hand back slowly, not out of fear, but out of recognition, because this felt familiar in a way that did not belong to this house. And Rex shifted slightly, lowering himself to the ground, his posture no longer alert but focused, like he had found exactly what he was meant to find. And Daniel reached for the edge of one of the boards, testing it gently, and it gave just enough to confirm what he already knew, that this section had been opened before, carefully, deliberately, and then closed again, not hidden in a careless way, but in a way meant to last. And as he worked his fingers along the seam, easing the board upward inch by inch, the faint smell beneath grew stronger, not unpleasant, just old, like air that had not moved in years. And the space revealed below was not large, not at first glance, just a narrow gap leading into a darkness that felt deeper than it should have been for something so small. And Rex leaned closer, his nose hovering just above the opening, not crossing into it, as if respecting a boundary only he could sense. And Daniel held the board in place, staring into that narrow space, aware of how quiet everything had become. Even the house above seemed to have settled into a stillness that matched the moment. And for the first time since stepping into this place, he realized that whatever waited below had not been disturbed by accident. It had been left this way on purpose, and some things are not hidden to be forgotten, but to be found only when the right hands are willing to listen long enough. Daniel did not rush the next movement, because something about the narrow opening demanded patience rather than urgency. And he had learned long ago that when a space feels like it has been waiting, the worst thing you can do is interrupt it carelessly. So he reached down again, setting the loosened board aside with deliberate care, exposing more of the gap beneath. And as the dim basement lights stretched into the opening, it revealed edges that were not natural, not just dirt or forgotten crawl space, but something shaped, constructed, the faint outline of a second layer beneath the floor, and the air that rose from it carried a stillness so complete it felt untouched by time, like opening a sealed room that had quietly held its breath for decades. And Rex shifted closer, but still did not cross the threshold, his posture calm yet attentive, his ears tilting slightly, as if tracking something deeper than sound. And Daniel leaned in, lowering himself onto one knee, his hand braced against the floor as he peered into the space. And at first it seemed like nothing more than darkness, but then his eyes adjusted, and shapes began to form, not clearly, not fully, but enough to suggest intention. A narrow wooden ladder descending just beyond the opening, its surface worn smooth but not broken, and that detail alone made Daniel pause, because where meant use, and use meant someone had been here, not once, but enough times to leave a mark. And he exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, and reached down, brushing his fingers along the top rung, feeling the texture, the faint warmth of wood that had not fully surrendered to the cold. And that was when the realization settled in, quiet but undeniable, that this space below was not abandoned in the way most people would think. It had been left intact, preserved in a way that suggested intention rather than neglect. And Rex gave a soft exhale beside him. Not a warning, not a signal of danger, but something closer to acknowledgement, as if this discovery matched something he had sensed long before Daniel understood it. And for a moment Daniel stayed exactly where he was, balanced between the known and the unknown, aware of how still everything had become. The house above silent, the night outside distant, the only movement coming from the slow rhythm of his own breathing. And he realized that this feeling, this quiet weight pressing gently against the moment, was not fear, it was awareness, the kind that comes when something long hidden begins to reveal itself not all at once, but piece by piece, as if testing whether it is ready to be seen. And Daniel shifted his weight forward slightly, enough to look deeper down the narrow ladder. And though the light did not reach far, there was just enough to catch the edge of something below, a flat surface, maybe a table or a crate, positioned with care rather than randomness. And that detail made something in his chest tighten, not with dread, but with a strange sense of familiarity, like stepping into a place you have never been yet somehow recognize. And Rex finally moved one paw forward, resting it lightly against the edge of the opening, his gaze steady, patient, waiting not for instruction but for understanding. And Daniel nodded once, more to himself than to the dog, because he understood now that this was not about what was hidden, it was about why it had been left this way. And some places do not reveal their stories all at once. They wait for someone willing to listen long enough to hear what the silence has been holding. Daniel tightened his grip along the edge of the opening, not out of fear, but out of respect for the unknown space below. And after a slow breath that steadied more than just his body, he shifted his weight and placed one boot carefully onto the first rung of the ladder, testing it before committing. And the wood responded with a soft, steady creak that sounded less like strain and more like acknowledgement, as if it had been waiting long enough to accept the weight again. And Rex remained above, his head lowered slightly, watching with that same unwavering focus, not following, not retreating, but holding position like a silent guardian at the threshold. And Daniel descended one step at a time, his movements measured, controlled, the kind that came from years of navigating unstable ground, where every shift mattered. And as he moved lower, the light from the basement stretched thinner, fading into a dim haze that barely reached the space beneath. But there was something else down here, something that softened the darkness, a faint, almost imperceptible glow that did not come from any visible source but seemed to exist in the air itself, subtle enough to guide his vision without revealing everything at once. And when his boots finally touched the ground below, the difference was immediate. The floor was solid, level, not dirt or unfinished foundation, but wood again, smoother, older, preserved in a way that felt intentional. And the air was still, not stale, not damp, but quiet in a way that felt undisturbed, like stepping into a room that had been closed not out of neglect, but out of care. And Daniel straightened slowly, his eyes adjusting as the shapes around him came into focus. And what he saw was not what he had expected. There were no scattered remnants, no signs of collapse or decay. Instead, there was order, a small table positioned near the far wall, a chair tucked neatly beneath it, a lantern resting on top as if it had been placed there and never touched again. And along one side of the room stood a narrow shelf, holding a few objects arranged with quiet precision, items that did not belong to the chaos of abandonment, but to the discipline of someone who had once lived with intention. And Daniel took a slow step forward, his boots making almost no sound against the floor, and he noticed how even his breathing seemed louder here, as if the space absorbed everything else and returned only the smallest echoes. And above him, the faint outline of the opening framed Rex's silhouette, still watching, still waiting, his presence steady and grounding even from a distance. And Daniel moved closer to the table, drawn not by curiosity alone, but by a sense of familiarity he could not yet explain. And as he reached out, his fingers hovered just above the surface, tracing the air before making contact. And the wood beneath his hand was cool, but not lifeless, carrying a quiet weight that suggested it had been part of something more than just a room. And then he noticed it, a small detail that shifted everything just slightly. The chair was not pushed in fully. It sat a few inches away from the table, angled just enough to suggest that whoever had last been here had not intended to leave permanently, but had simply stepped away for a moment that somehow stretched into years. And Daniel stood there, hand resting lightly on the table, eyes scanning the room with a growing understanding that this place was not hidden out of fear or secrecy. It had been preserved, held in stillness, waiting not for discovery alone, but for someone who would recognize that what remained here was not unfinished. It was simply waiting to be understood. Daniel stood still for a long moment, letting the quiet settle around him the way dust settles in a place untouched by time. And there was something about the room that did not ask to be explored quickly. It asked to be noticed, piece by piece, detail by detail. And he moved slowly along the edge of the space, his eyes adjusting not just to the dim light, but to the rhythm of the room itself, the way everything seemed placed with intention rather than convenience. And as he approached the narrow shelf along the wall, he saw that the objects resting there were not random remnants, but carefully kept belongings. A small tin box with its lid closed, a folded piece of cloth worn thin at the edges, and beside it, A row of notebooks stacked neatly, their covers faded but intact, and Daniel reached out, pausing just before touching them, as if the act required permission, not from anyone present, but from the silence itself. And when his fingers finally brushed against the top notebook, the cover felt smooth but aged, carrying the faint texture of something handled often and then left undisturbed for a very long time. And he lifted it gently, the weight lighter than he expected, and opened it slowly. The pages inside yellowed but carefully preserved, filled with handwriting that was steady, deliberate, each line written with the kind of discipline that comes from someone who values clarity over decoration. And Daniel did not read every word at once. He let his eyes move gradually across the page, catching fragments, dates, measurements, observations, not random thoughts but records, as if the person who had written this had been documenting something important, something worth remembering even if no one else ever saw it. And he turned a page, then another, noticing how consistent the entries were, how each one carried the same careful tone, and there was no sign of panic, no hurried strokes, only patience, the quiet kind that builds over time when someone chooses to stay rather than leave. And behind him, Rex shifted slightly above, his movement barely audible, but enough for Daniel to glance back up toward the opening, where the dog's silhouette remained steady, watching, present, not anxious, just aware. And Daniel lowered his gaze again, drawn back to the notebook in his hands. And there, near the edge of one page, he noticed something that broke the pattern just enough to stand out. A line written slightly darker than the rest, pressed deeper into the paper as if the moment had mattered more, and though he did not yet understand its meaning, he felt its weight. The way certain words carry more than information, they carry intention. And he closed the notebook slowly, not out of hesitation but out of respect, because whatever this place held was not meant to be uncovered all at once. It was meant to be understood in pieces, and he set the book back exactly where he had found it, aligning it carefully with the others, and stepped back, taking in the room. Again, the table, the chair, the quiet order of it all, and he realized that this was not a place left behind in the usual sense. It was a place that had been kept, preserved in a way that suggested someone believed it would matter again someday. And Daniel rested his hand lightly against the edge of the shelf, feeling the steady presence of the space around him. And for the first time since stepping into the basement, he understood that what Rex had found was not something to fear. It was something that had been waiting, patiently, for someone willing to slow down enough to listen. Daniel remained beside the shelf for a few seconds longer than necessary, his hand still resting lightly against the wood, as if grounding himself in the quiet certainty of the room. And then he turned his attention back to the table at the center, drawn not by curiosity alone, but by the subtle imbalance he had noticed before, that small space between the chair and the table that suggested interruption rather than completion. And he stepped closer, his boots silent against the floor, the air unchanged but somehow more present, like it was aware of him now. And the lantern on the table caught his eye again, its glass clean despite the years, its metal frame untouched by rust, as if it had been maintained or perhaps preserved in a way that did not follow ordinary time. And he reached for it carefully, lifting it just enough to feel its weight. And though it was not lit, there was a faint warmth to it, not heat, but something gentler, like it had once held light that had not fully faded. And Daniel set it back down slowly, his movements deliberate, mindful of the stillness around him. And then he noticed something else, something he had missed before, a thin line along the surface of the table, almost invisible unless the light struck it at the right angle. And he leaned in slightly, tracing it with his eyes rather than his fingers, and realized it was not a scratch or a crack, it was a seam, subtle but intentional, running just off center. And he paused, not out of hesitation but out of recognition, because hidden compartments were not unfamiliar to him, and neither was the patience required to open them without forcing what was meant to be revealed slowly. And he placed both hands gently on the table, applying the slightest pressure along the seam, testing rather than prying. And for a moment nothing happened, the room holding its breath in that quiet way it seemed to prefer. And then there was a soft shift, almost imperceptible, like wood settling into alignment, and the surface gave just enough to confirm that it was meant to move. And Daniel eased it open carefully, revealing a shallow compartment beneath. and inside there was only one object, placed with precision at the center, a small envelope. Its edges slightly worn but intact, and the paper carried a tone that had deepened with age, not brittle, not fragile, but enduring, and Daniel did not reach for it immediately. He simply looked at it, aware that whatever this was, it had been left here on purpose, not forgotten, not misplaced, but entrusted to time. And above him, Rex shifted again, letting out a soft breath that echoed faintly down into the space, and Daniel glanced up briefly, meeting the dog's steady gaze. And there was something in that moment, something unspoken but understood, that this was the reason they had come here, not by plan, not by chance, but by something quieter, something that did not rush or demand, only waited, and Daniel lowered his gaze back to the envelope, finally reaching for it with a careful hand, lifting it from its place, feeling the weight of it, light but present, and as he turned it over, he saw that there was no name written on the front, no marking to claim it, only a single line pressed faintly into the paper, almost invisible unless you knew to look for it. And though he could not yet read it clearly, he felt its intention, the way some words carry meaning even before they are understood, and he held the envelope in both hands, standing in the center of a room that had waited in silence for longer than he could measure, and he realized that whatever lay inside was not meant to change everything all at once. It was meant to be opened at the exact moment someone was ready to understand why it had been left behind. Daniel held the envelope for a long moment without opening it, his fingers resting lightly along its edges as if the paper itself carried more than just whatever words lay inside, and the room seemed to grow even quieter in that pause. The kind of silence that does not press but instead settles gently, like it understands the weight of what is about to be revealed, and he turned the envelope slightly in his hands, angling it toward the faint light until the pressed line on its surface became just visible enough to follow, not written in ink, but embossed with intention, a message left without urgency, yet impossible to ignore, and though the letters were subtle, they carried a clarity that did not need to be read aloud to be understood, and Daniel exhaled slowly, not because he was uncertain, but because he recognized something in that moment, the familiar rhythm of discovery that does not rush forward but unfolds at its own pace. And with careful hands he opened the envelope along its edge, the paper parting with a soft sound that seemed louder than it should have been in the stillness, and inside there was a single folded sheet, no more, no less, placed with the same precision as everything else in the room, and he unfolded it slowly, smoothing it between his fingers, and the handwriting that appeared across the page matched the notebook's, steady, measured, written by someone who had taken the time to think before putting anything down, and Daniel's eyes moved across the lines, not rushing, allowing each word to settle as it came, and what he found there was not a warning, not a confession, but something quieter, something that carried the weight of reflection rather than urgency, a message written not for anyone specific, but for whoever would one day stand exactly where he stood now. And as he read, the room seemed to shift, not physically, but in the way understanding changes how a place feels, the air no longer just still but purposeful, as if the space itself had been holding this meaning all along, waiting for it to be recognized, and behind him, above the opening, Rex lowered himself slightly, resting his chest against the floor, his presence steady and calm, no longer searching, no longer guiding, but simply there, as if his part in this had already been fulfilled, and Daniel lowered the paper just slightly, his gaze drifting from the words to the room around him, seeing it now not as a hidden space, not as something buried beneath the house, but as a continuation of a life that had chosen to remain quiet rather than disappear, and he understood then that the message in his hands was not about fear, not about something that should never have been found, but about something that had been waiting to be understood by someone who knew how to listen, and Daniel folded the paper carefully, not closing it away, but holding it with a kind of respect that does not come from obligation but from recognition, and he stood there for a moment longer, surrounded by a silence that no longer felt empty, and realized that some discoveries do not change the world in an instant, they simply shift the way you see what was already there, waiting patiently beneath the surface. Daniel remained in the center of the room with the folded paper still in his hand, and for a while he did not move, not because he did not know what to do next, but because something inside him had shifted in a way that required stillness to fully understand, and the words he had just read did not echo loudly. They settled quietly, like a truth that had always been there, but had never been given a place to rest. And he looked around the room again, not as a place hidden beneath a house, but as something preserved with intention, a space that had not been abandoned, but rather entrusted to time itself. And he stepped slowly back toward the table, placing the paper gently beside the envelope, not sealing it away, but leaving it open, as if its purpose was not to be hidden again. And as he adjusted the chair slightly, aligning it with the table, he noticed how natural the movement felt, not like he was rearranging something ooshed to him, but like he was restoring a rhythm that had been paused rather than ended. And above him Rex shifted again, his paws moving softly as he repositioned himself at the edge of the opening. His ears relaxed now, his breathing steady, and there was no tension in him anymore. No searching, no alertness, only a quiet presence that mirrored the calm that had settled into the room. And Daniel took a slow step back, giving himself space to take in everything at once. The shelf, the notebooks, the lantern, the careful placement of each object. And he realized that nothing here had been left by accident. Every detail carried intention, not for display, not for discovery alone, but for understanding. And that realization changed something deeper than curiosity. It brought a sense of connection, subtle but undeniable, like recognizing a pattern that had always been there beneath the surface. And he turned toward the ladder, his movements unhurried, not out of reluctance to leave, but because leaving did not feel like closing something. It felt like carrying it forward, and as he placed his hand on the first rung, he paused briefly, looking back once more at the room below, and in that moment it did not feel distant or separate. It felt present, like it would remain with him even when he stepped away, and Rex let out a soft breath as Daniel began to climb, the faint sound echoing gently in the quiet space. And when Daniel emerged back into the basement above, the air felt different, not lighter or heavier, but clearer, as if something unseen had settled into place. And Rex stood immediately, stepping back to give him space, then moving closer, pressing lightly against his side in a gesture that carried no urgency, only confirmation. And Daniel rested his hand briefly against the dog's neck, feeling the steady warmth there, the quiet certainty that had guided him to this moment without force or fear. And together they stood in the dim basement, the open space beneath them no longer hidden in the same way. And Daniel realized that what had been found was not something to regret, not something that should never have been seen, but something that had been waiting for the right kind of attention, the kind that does not rush to conclusions but stays long enough to understand. And some discoveries do not end when you walk away from them. They continue in the way you choose to carry what you have seen. Morning arrived slowly, not with a sudden burst of light, but with a gradual softening of the darkness that had settled over the house through the night. And Daniel stood by the small kitchen window with a cup of coffee warming his hands, watching the pale gold of early sunlight stretch across the quiet yard. And for the first time since he had moved into this place, the silence did not feel heavy. It felt complete, like something that no longer needed to be filled. And behind him Rex lay stretched out on the wooden floor, his breathing deep and even, the kind of rest that only comes when there is nothing left to search for. And Daniel glanced back at him, noticing how the dog's posture had changed, no longer alert to unseen signals, no longer listening for something hidden beneath the surface, but settled in a way that spoke of quiet certainty. And Daniel took a slow sip of his coffee, the warmth grounding him in the present moment, and his thoughts drifted not to the strangeness of what they had found, but to the meaning that had revealed itself piece by piece. And after a while he set the cup down and walked toward the basement door, his steps unhurried, his hand steady as he opened it once more. And the air below felt familiar now, not as something unknown, but as part of the home he was beginning to understand. And he descended the steps without hesitation, the soft creak of wood beneath his boots no longer echoing with uncertainty. And when he reached the floor, he paused only briefly before moving to the corner where the opening remained. And this time he did not kneel with caution. He simply reached down and carefully set the board back into place, aligning it just as it had been before, not sealing it away out of fear, but restoring it with intention, the same quiet care that had preserved it for so long. And when the wood settled flush with the rest of the floor, there was a sense of completion that did not need explanation, and Daniel rested his hand there for a moment, feeling the stillness beneath, knowing it remained unchanged, not gone, not forgotten, but simply at peace, and he stood again, turning back toward the stairs where Rex now waited at the top, watching him with calm eyes that held no urgency, only presence. And Daniel climbed back up, each step steady, and when he reached the top, Rex stepped aside and fell into step beside him as they moved into the main room, the house. Quiet but no longer empty, and Daniel paused near the doorway, looking out once more at the morning light. And he understood then that what they had found had not been something to regret. It had been something to carry forward, a reminder that not all hidden things are meant to be feared. Some are meant to be understood, and in understanding them, something within you finds its place again. And Rex settled down near the door, resting his head on his paws, his watch finally over, and Daniel remained standing for a moment longer, breathing in the quiet that now felt like it belonged. And perhaps that was the true purpose of what lay beneath the house, not to be uncovered for its mystery alone, but to remind someone that even the quietest places hold stories that wait patiently for the right person to listen, and sometimes, listening is all it takes to bring them home.